Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome. My name is Nabila Jaffer, and I'm the Program Manager for Strategic Projects at the University of Michigan Library IT. I'm a South Asian female in my 40s, wearing a black shirt with blue headscarf. I'm a member of Program Committee and today's host, guiding you all through the program. Samvera is dedicated to providing a welcoming and harassment-free community experience for everyone. Samvera was conceived and executed as a collaborative open source effort from its very beginning, committed to openness and transparency in all that it does, code, designs, and discussions. We are equally committed to helpful and respectful communication. Next slide, please. The community has both an official code of conduct and an official anti-harassment policy. The code of conduct expresses our aspirations about how we want to work and interact. The anti-harassment policy provides a framework to deal effectively with issues that make any member of the community feel unsafe or threatened. The goal of the policy is to provide prompt and supportive assistance to anyone subject to any form of harassment. The policy is only one aspect of our broader desire to build a diverse and welcoming community that encourages participation and contribution from all participants without bias. If you see something missing, we invite your input to the policy and making Samvera a better place. If you haven't already, please take time to review the documents today. We expect participants at all community events and forums to honor these standards. The links to these would be posted in the Slack channel. Next slide, please. Building on the framework provided by the two policy documents, Samvera community members work together to create and promote a welcoming and safe community. If a situation arises that you feel you cannot address alone, please contact a member of this year's program committee, a member of steering, or a helper. We are well positioned and prepared to assist you. Helpers are distinguished by a special rainbow symbol by their name in Slack. Helpers are volunteers who give their time to ensure that Samvera remains a safe space for open, collaborative work, both online and at events. Next slide, please. Here's the list of current helpers. You might want to take a screenshot of the slide for your reference if you haven't already done that on Friday. You can find us on Slack. Please direct message one or more of us if you have a question, any question at all, or any concern, especially if it has to do with our code of conduct or anti-harassment policy. If you see us on Zoom during a Connect session and want to reach out, please feel free to use the private chat feature. And we have an email list that you can always use to reach out for help or information. We all receive those messages. More information about the helpers is on Wiki, link noted here, which will be posted in Slack channel also. If you want to become a helper, we welcome new volunteers. It's a great way to serve and support our community. And on the next slide, we have today's schedule. So we have 5 presentations, 30 minutes each from now until 1:50 p.m. There will be 2 10 minutes break, first one at noon and second one at 10 past 1 o'clock. From 1:50 to 2:20 p.m., we will have the interest group and working group updates. And just a reminder, there is a community building event from 2:30 to 3 p.m. after Connect presentations. Our first presentation today is by Adam and Karen, and I will hand it off to Adam and Karen.
Right. Assuming people can see my screen okay. I think that's yes.
Yep.
So yeah, This is a co-presentation between myself and Karen. My name is Adam Arling. I'm a white male in my 40s, sitting in a teal-colored office with Chicago snow in the background out the window, sadly.
I'm Karen Shaw. I'm a white female in my 40s with long gray hair and glasses, wearing a black shirt, sitting in a beige room.
So today our presentation is called Case Study Batch Update, User-Driven Approach. And we're going to kind of wrap it in the context of design thinking and talk a little bit about how our work group has been evolving the past few years. So over the past few years, our Northwestern University Libraries development team has experimented with kind of a newish, I guess, for our team workflow for modular development of repository applications. Maybe this would make sense by describing our team. So we're made up of a project manager, a subject matter expert, 3 backend developers, and 2 front-end developers. So when our team approaches a new application feature or issue or something to work on, we see the work from different perspectives. And I think the workflow that we're evolving towards is parallel development and embracing our team's different perspectives. So how can we break down an issue or feature into parts that can be built at the same time?
So what did we do before? We did build batch functionality, both a batch ingest and a batch update in our previous 2 repository systems. But while we did practice Scrum at the time and batch feature was discussed during planning and stand-ups, the process was not user-driven. In general, 1 or 2 developers designed and coded the feature and delivered it as a finished product. Decisions about UI design and flow were made by developers based on what was possible or easiest within the existing framework. The process was not iterative, and the product was often hard to change once delivered. The resulting user experience was lacking. Errors often happened silently, confusing users, and were hard for developers to diagnose and troubleshoot. Some features and operations weren't implemented at all, so users often had to ask developers to run a script to do this or that. Next slide.
So design thinking. What is design thinking? Well, this simple description or graphic, I guess, kind of sums it up. Design thinking is a problem-solving technique. In Northwestern, they offer a design thinking workshop, and a few of us in our team have attended this session and thought, why not give it a shot and apply it to what our team's working on? Design thinking has huge buy-in in the tech community and embraces the idea that ideas can come from everywhere, that everyone is creative, and it seems pretty hip. So why not give it a shot? So there's a lot of literature out there on the key tenets of design thinking, but for today, we'll just focus on Google's 3-phase approach, which is empathy, expansive thinking, and experimentation. So empathy, and I think this is said well from the Google design thinking team, they quote, "It's great to create an innovative service, but not so great to build one that's useless to people." So with empathy, users are at the center of design thinking and ought to be the #1 focus. By listening to and really hearing users, we can create meaningful solutions. Expansive thinking, it's more or less brainstorming. The focus is not on arriving at a single perfect solution, but rather to really try and see an issue from every conceivable angle. Expansive thinking is also about thinking really, really outside the box and going big. So instead of aiming for something just a little bit better, really trying to stretch our brains to aim 10 times better, even if this is unrealistic. This exercise alone may open doors to solutions previously unseen. And then after one arrives at or a team arrives at a list of ideas through the expansive thinking phase, you want to see which ideas work and which don't, and you'll want to try to figure this out as fast as possible. And this is the experimentation phase. So you prototype, test, build early stage versions, experiment. Thing is, developers, you've all heard, fail fast. And user feedback is crucial to refining the project direction. And I think through experimentation, it makes design thinking a process.
So with this new process in mind, now we'll look at how we are applying it in the case of developing a batch edit feature in our new repository system, Meadow. Next slide. First of all, we needed to understand from a user's perspective what problem we were trying to solve. So we had meetings with users and asked a lot of questions. Next slide. Basically, what we heard was, we want to ingest our assets so that they are tracked in our preservation system and then be able to describe them in large batches so that we can quickly publish them for end user and researcher consumption. So specifically for batch edit, what we heard was our users wanted to be able to quickly and transparently apply metadata changes across thousands of records at once. Next slide. We also heard that we needed to architect a system that addressed some of the frustrations and shortcomings of our old batch systems, our old systems batch functionality, that it didn't scale well. Timeouts and system overloads were frequent. Problems were often silent and completely hidden from users and confusing for both users and the developers trying to troubleshoot. Our users asked for an intuitive, simple as possible UI and the ability to queue jobs, monitor success, failure, and progress of submitted batch edits. Next slide. So once we identified the problem, we began prototyping with wireframes using the Sketch Cloud software. Mostly our wireframes have been authored by our product owner or UI developer, but other team members have created them at times. The wireframes are intentionally unrefined and not detailed because they are work in progress. We don't want users to focus on details at this point. We presented the wireframes to users during feedback sessions and asked for input. This is an example of the wireframing we did for the management dashboard part of the batch edit flow. It shows the very minimal tracking of batches required. We talked about the desire for the whole batch to succeed or fail as a unit. Out of the wireframing discussions, we identified a need to index the batch ID on work records so that affected works could be easily identified with a breadcrumb trail of changes made during batches. We noted this with a sticky. We did not further refine the wireframes as they are just a jumping off point. Next slide. Here's another example that these were the wireframes surrounding adding and removing of controlled terms. They led to many discussions and questions. How to disambiguate same term from different authorities, whether to perform append or replace operations, and how to present selection and confirmation screens to users. Next slide.
Something else we engaged in during the expansive thinking phase was, and actually the empathy phase as well, it's been whiteboarding. So when we used to work on campus in the office, we turned our sprint room, which is our just like a daily meeting room, into a total mess. So you can, it's got the paint on the walls where you can, you're allowed to like write everywhere on them. And we took full advantage of that. So you walk into the room when we were first thinking about how we're going to approach not only batch edit, but other parts of an application we've been working on for the past 18 months. So you'd walk in the room and you see writing spread across all four walls, wireframe printouts taped to service architecture drawings or magic marker system timelines. And when design thinking through batch edit, we, through this process allowed us to address questions such as how and where do we select batch items? How do we handle, say, 10,000 records? How do we handle 25,000 records? How do we track job status, both on the back end and the front end? How do we communicate through job status, the API, and then through the UI to the end user of what is going on in the batch edit process from beginning to end?
So before going too far in one direction, we want to get a working but minimal coded prototype quickly and get it in front of users for feedback. With design thinking like Agile, prototyping is a continual process of generating feedback and iterating, not a one-time thing. Our route to get from wireframes to a working prototype was to start with the API. First, we planned out our GraphQL API, and then we proceeded to mocking it. Defining the shape of the data up front keeps both teams on the same page. Next slide. In the case of batch edit, the design of the API forced a number of team discussions and decisions. In some cases, we had to reach out to end users for feedback and expertise during this stage. Some of the questions and discussions we had, how do we potentially pass thousands and thousands of IDs to the back end? Or do we pass the Elasticsearch query itself? Since we knew we needed to scale very large, we went with passing the query, knowing that it might fall down and we'd need to rethink. One theme from design thinking is that the first idea is often a bad idea. How do we prevent race conditions? Should we be querying the GraphQL API or our Elasticsearch API? What about a lag between the two? Who is responsible for scrolling the Elasticsearch results, the front end or the back end? If a user updates a field, is that an append operation or replace operation, or do they have a choice? So during these meetings, while looking at wireframes, the API emerged. Next slide. When we say API mocking, what we mean is that we actually publish our queries and mutations in our GraphQL schema, but return canned or static responses. That way, both the front and back end agree on the shape of the data and can refer to it while working independently. We tried a couple different approaches to mocking, both the back end in the Elixir code and also on the front end using mocks in the Apollo client. This graphic shows our GraphQL schema with the batch update mutation highlighted. So with the API in place, we are ready to start prototyping in code. Next slide.
And as we are prototyping in the experimentation phase, we're kind of doing this in kind of, I guess, three areas: on the back end, at the API level, and also on the front end. So there's a few areas of the user interface that I'll kind of touch on briefly that we needed to flesh out for batch edit. First, primarily, how do we identify a group of items to even be batch edited? So for this, we experimented with having search be the gatekeeper to batch processing. So through the primary search screen, which there's only one, a user can search, facet, and refine to their heart's content and arrive at a body of works. Most of our users, it was identified, at least for this system, are quote unquote power users and rely heavily on faceting for identifying items and grouping them for processing. So prototyping facet alternative UIs was also a big part of this process. Another UI experiment is how do we provide manual selection of batch items? So say a user is just looking to update the description field on a few items in a given collection. How do we combine search, faceting, and selecting manually items in a reasonably intuitive UI? So here we prototyped a solution of a component managing parallel states or scopes on the front end. One state keeps track of items refined through search and faceting, and another state would keep track of manually selected items. So the experiment here was, how do we keep these two states in sync? Perhaps the biggest experiment we needed to prove out in this batch edit feature was how to keep track of selected items when moving around the application or changing routes. During brainstorming, we considered, again, as maybe we mentioned a few times, like what scale numbers. So what if we're talking about 500 records? Probably not a big deal. 5,000, a little bit more of a big deal. 10,000, 25,000. I mean, what do we do with this? Do we put 10,000 IDs? Do we put that in a query string in the browsers? Into the browser? Do we try to stash this in local storage? Would things just crash? So I guess testing it to design thinking, or as we were working through this, our project managers kind of laid it out one day. It's like, what if we just don't pass anything around and we just pick up the query and kind of move that around? Which seemed to work really well because Elasticsearch is fast. So the idea that we prototyped, which we had no idea whether it would work from beginning to end, is that as the user, they search and pass it, and then when their final query is done, then we capture that, which is just a JSON object. And this JSON object we pass around the application. So we can re-execute the query only where we need access to the query's records, whether that's on the front end or the back end. Another recent prototype experiment, which we're actually in the process of user testing right now, last week, and then continuing next week, is how to deliver intuitive add, remove, and replacing of batch items in the UI. So the trick here is aligning three things: the API design against a sensible UI for the user to know what makes sense for how to say replace this or remove this. And then finally, to keep that maintained against component and HTML form patterns in the UI that we can spread throughout the application, reuse, and make consistent for further maintenance beyond just building this. And again, as we're experimenting, prototyping, and getting to the point where simple versions are, an idea is relatively stable, to get this in front of end users, what we kind of did is our project manager would run some initial prototypes in the app by end users with some quick feedback. For example, some helpful feedback we received. Some of the beginning stages of batch, for example, was a request to get a quick visual of what the users were actually editing before, say, mistakenly changing the wrong 1,000 items. Users also said they thought it'd be helpful to have some kind of built-in safety check, kind of similar to what GitHub does before you completely wipe out or remove a repository. So as part of the process, we go back to that, and let's just prototype a quick version of what the users asked for. Let's say pull in 25 items from the saved Elasticsearch query that we're passing around, and maybe just a subtle little notification that says, hey, you are about to edit X number of items, just so it's kind of extra clear. And again, this is just an iterative process moving throughout.
So as a result of our initial prototyping process, we knew that our batches needed to take place within a transaction. An entire batch succeeds or fails. We knew we needed a simple batch update mutation in our API with replace, add, and delete operations that also takes an Elasticsearch query. We knew that we needed to iterate over the Elasticsearch scroll and apply changes to each page of work IDs within one transaction. Next slide. So this made it easy to break up the backend work into iterative pieces to be worked on independently by developers. First, we implemented batch add and delete of controlled terms, then batch add and replace of non-controlled terms, collection assignment, and finally, we are still in the process of implementing queuing and batch management functionality. At each step, as the work is finished, we replace the mock endpoints with working functionality. Next slide. So right now, the state of our batch edit is that it's about 80% done. So here are some of my thoughts about the process, keeping in mind that it's still in progress. Does our process work? In the end, we have to ask our users if they are happy and then keep refining our process. We have to remember to keep our process flexible, not rigid. Keep the things that work and trash the things that don't. I thought the wireframes were a great way to get a prototype in front of users quickly for feedback. I thought the API design and mocking did help keep the UI stable and both teams working at once, but it had a few downsides. The mocking took time. It was more complicated than maybe it should have been, or it's possible that we just haven't found the right set of tools. The Apollo client mocking seemed especially involved. On smaller features, developers are tending to skip the mocking and just proceed to coding. There's also the question of whose responsibility is the mocking? Is it the front or the back end? It seemed naturally that the backend developers had a little more idea of the shape of the data in the API, but when you're using the Apollo client, that's the JavaScript tool on the front end, so it just became a little unclear. The API did evolve a little bit with things we didn't anticipate, but in general, it remained pretty solid throughout development and worked pretty well as a contract between the front and the back end. Another thing we seemed to struggle a little bit with, that it was sometimes hard to get a minimal working prototype in front of users because it was not working enough to generate meaningful feedback. And this could be because our entire application is greenfield and there's a lot of other sort of unimplemented distracting things. So we're hoping that this gets a little smoother in the future. Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, as the UI developer of does design thinking, is it an asset to the development team? I would say absolutely. And I think any process or problem solving technique in development, which puts the focus on end users, is ultimately probably going to be the most efficient solution. As developers, or anyone that knows developers, know it's super easy for a developer, and I'm guilty of this, we all are, to spend a month, if not more, building something that we think is the most awesome, elegant solution. And then when we deliver it, we realize that it's possibly way over engineered and also maybe not what the user necessarily even wanted or possibly even cares about. I also think applying design thinking to this batch editing process, it's good to keep in mind that we're trying to create solutions to pretty complex problems when it comes to the issue of scale on both the front and back ends. But I think a nice thing is that through this iterative experiment and feedback and learn process, I think our team has learned a lot, and we've shifted directions a few times when prototypes didn't quite prove out. And we've been able to pivot reasonably well. And I think as a result of this, we're going to wind up, when this is all said and done, with a much more robust, tested, and somewhat proven product when it's ready to actually go into production for users. And then I think just with design thinking in general, after becoming a little bit familiar with it the past year, I really like the inclusiveness of involving all team members, developers and non-developers, technical and non-technical, and knowing that it's okay and even encouraged to think outside the box about creating meaningful solutions. So if your team's thinking about it, I would definitely encourage it. Go for it.
Thank you, Karen and Adam. This was really interesting. If anybody has any questions, you can post them in the Slack channel. And our next presentation is by Brendan.
Hi. Let's see, I'll share my screen real quick. Cool. Can everybody see my slides?
Yep, we can.
All right, great. So thank you, Nabila. It's good to see you again. It's been a while. I'm Brendan Quinn, a developer in repository and digital curation at Northwestern University Libraries, Adam and Karen's coworker. I'm a 37-year-old white male with red hair and a mustache. As I get older, it's more like salt and paprika as opposed to the redhead I used to be. I'm sitting in front of a virtual background showing Northwestern's Weber Arch in the snow because I'm in a real winter mood right now. It's snowing outside of my window. Today, I'll be giving a brief introduction to Meadow, our new digital repository application built with Elixir, React, and GraphQL in the middle. I was trying to max out the length of my title for Sketch, but I didn't hit it. Maybe to answer Daniel's question that just came up in the Q&A. So I'm going to take kind of a high-level overview of the Meadow application that implements that batch edit functionality we just looked at. So why we went down this path, what our project goals are, and some high points of functionality we've developed so far. First, I'd like to introduce the rest of our development team. So there's Adam, Divya, Michael, myself, Veronica, David, and Karen. We do the day-to-day development on the project. A special shout out to Laura Alanya, who some of you may know, our digital preservation librarian, recently, a couple weeks ago, got a new job. So thanks for everything, and we wish you the best. And then additionally, I'd like to thank David Schober and Carolyn Casey, our team leadership, for giving us the chance to see how far we can go with a new language and a new framework for our team. So thanks. So here's some high-level overview of the problem we're trying to solve, as well as our high-level goals. And sorry for this slide, is kind of busy. There's a lot of information here, but the slides will be posted. So if you want to look in more detail, feel free to dig in and ask questions later on. We're on Slack all the time. So you can see in this diagram, we have kind of our workflow from when items are scanned or digitized and all the way through to when they're published into our digital collections front end. And so what we've had in the past is, you can see the red bar at the bottom is we have digitized materials that are stored on network storage for months or even years at a time without being tracked by any kind of a system. Now, currently, those items are ingested into Donut, which is our Hyrax application. But so our new focus is on, and also that red area we lovingly call the danger zone, where our items aren't being really tracked except for manual processes and spreadsheets and stuff like that. So what we are aimed is to get items out of the danger zone and into a system that we manage, and then describe those materials while they're in a place of relative safety. So our goals for the project are preservation first design. We wanted to build a system with digital preservation best practices in mind from the outset, rather than backfill features later on where they might not fit. Our users also wanted transparency into preservation concerns, so we developed UI components for increasing that kind of visibility of things like checksums, checking for existence in the preservation bucket, on demand, things like that. There's a lot more to come there, but that's what we have so far. We wanted a fast and scalable ingest pipeline. So like Adam and Karen were saying, our power users ingest thousands and thousands of records at a time, and we wanted to be able to support that. The ability to batch edit metadata. Those were those wonderful slides you just saw. And so we wanted concurrency and fault tolerance. Those are things that are provided by the Elixir programming language, which I'll get into in a little bit. But the Elixir and AWS services we use allow us to write software that executes tasks in parallel, which speeds up processing. And the fault tolerance mostly comes from Elixir's supervision tree, which gives our applications the ability to recover and retry when inevitable errors arise. And then we also wanted to focus on having a nice development environment. So we prioritize building using Docker containers and making local seed tasks to build out sample data quickly and easily. So with just a few commands, you can have a local dev environment with many thousands of records with metadata that you can test functionality or check for bugs and things like that. So I'll go over our architecture overview. First, some terminology. There's a lot of kind of terminology going on here, so I'll try to break it down in a sort of simple way. So we have Elixir, which is a functional dynamic programming language with immutable data running on the Erlang virtual machine, also known as the Beam. We use the Phoenix framework, which is built on Elixir, which is a web framework for Elixir applications, similar to Ruby on Rails. We used a JavaScript front end, which I was like trying to think of a definition for JavaScript, and I came up with just the language of the web, for better or worse, LOL. And we use React and reactive search to build out our UI components and search on the front end. We use a GraphQL API. GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries with your data using a type system. And then we use Absinthe, which is a GraphQL implementation of our GraphQL implementation for Elixir, which has integrations for Elixir backend and JavaScript front ends. And then our search engine we're using is Elasticsearch, similar to Solr, many of you I'm sure are familiar with. And we use a whole host of Amazon Web Services, many more probably than I could list out here, for our databases, our searches, our container hosting, our routing, everything basically is powered by our web services. And then Docker for containerization, both locally and in deployment. So just a little bit about why we chose these things. Elixir has a Ruby-like syntax, which made for a relatively smooth transition for us. It has a lot of great built-in features that match our needs, like data immutability, process model, pattern matching, the pipeline operator, which is kind of a cheeky joke in my slide, which is kind of what the pipeline operator looks like. First-class documentation, so there's documentation everywhere built in. The XUnit testing framework we've gotten a lot of use out of, and it's really great. And also the library ecosystem for Elixir has come a long way. It's a relatively new programming language, but a lot is out there already. So things like Ecto for our database, Elasticsearch, XAWS for communicating with the AWS SDK, and other things that don't start with the letter E. In terms of JavaScript, we have actually a lot of experience with JavaScript. We have a React application running in production currently for our digital collections front end, so it works well for us, and we decided to keep using it for Meadow. And its component paradigm gives us the ability to build and reuse discrete pieces of functionality, which is really nice. And then GraphQL is also new for us, but it provides an API layer between the front end and back end that allows us to develop features independently, especially using mocks and things like that. The Absinthe implementation we use has integrations for the front end, back end, so that's really nice. It provides excellent documentation for end users, so there's a graphical playground user experience you can use, like if you go to /API/graphical on Meadow, you can see and use our GraphQL API directly. And it provides the queries and mutations we need to query and update our records, as well as subscriptions that power WebSockets for real-time messaging. And for the visual thinkers among us, this is kind of a diagram of what we have in place in AWS. It's definitely simplified, and I'm ignoring things like networking and security. And just to keep it as simple as possible, we have in the center of this diagram is an Amazon ECS container task. So it's a Docker container, which is where our React GraphQL and Phoenix/Elixir application lives. So it runs in a Docker container as an ECS container task. And then outside of the container task, we have microservices that our application uses to communicate with, to do work, store data, send messages, grab users, things like that. So I'm going to change gears a little bit here and talk about, this is a metadata is kind of a joke we've had since the beginning of the project. So I'll talk a little bit about our data modeling. Our challenges we have in our HireX application currently, we have pretty complicated data models for our work records. We have 50 plus descriptive and administrative properties. We have many properties that are backed by external authorities and local authorities. And then we have complex UI components and functionality we need to support that sort of glut of information to make it easy for our end users to see and manipulate. So how did we implement this data model? In Elixir, there's a library called Ecto, which is the most prominent library for data mapping and database interaction in the Elixir ecosystem. For the Valkyrie users among us, a lot of the patterns that Valkyrie implements were inspired by Ecto, such as chain sets and the repository pattern that uses adapters so you can switch databases and things like that. So Ecto came up a lot in our early conversations about Valkyrie, which is, it's been fun to use Ecto for the past year and a half. We're using the Postgres implementation of the Ecto SQL library as our adapter. But you don't even need to use a database to use Ecto if all you want is change sets and validation, things like that. We have sort of standard library data models for works, file sets, and collections. Those are implemented using Ecto schemas that provide relationships like has, many, belongs to, all that standard stuff. And then we also use, Ecto provides embedded schemas where we store our administrative and descriptive metadata as JSON-B directly on the work and file set records. So it's nice to use because Ecto tries to protect you from N+1 queries by forcing you to preload associations manually. And JSON-B stored as embedded schemas lets you sort of bypass that and lets you avoid the need to preload the associations all the time. It does have sort of a flip side where it makes querying and updating a little bit more cumbersome, but in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip over that for today. And then also Ecto queries and chain sets underpin our GraphQL API for building out our front-end queries and mutations. So in the previous presentation, Karen and Adam went over batch editing, but I kind of wanted to go into depth about our batch ingest pipeline. So how do we get our records into the system in order to be described and edited? So I sort of chickened out on doing a live demo. So I made pre-recorded animated GIFs or GIFs, whichever you prefer. So what you're going to see here is sort of a fast moving demonstration that I'll try to describe in real time, where you're going to see our ingest process through the front end of our Phoenix and React application. All the data that you see is going to be powered by GraphQL queries, mutations, and subscriptions. So without further ado, here it comes. I hope you can see it. So what's happening is there's an ingest project where someone's going to add an ingest sheet. We're going to choose the spreadsheet that we're going to load up and then hit the upload button. So what's happening now is we're going to check to see whether the files are in the staging bucket in Amazon S3 and do some work on the spreadsheet, which I'll describe in the next couple of slides, and then process our works and file sets and run them through our ingest pipeline. You can see the sort of the real-time WebSockets happening there. And oh, I think my GIF may be oh, there we go. So then you can see the successfully ingested ingest sheet in our system, and that last little screen was our batch edit interface. So I'm guessing most of you have seen a spreadsheet before, but this one is ours and we like it. The important thing to note here is that the first two columns, the work accession number and the accession number, are used to group works and file sets, which are then run through the ingest pipeline. And the file name we end up storing as S3 metadata attached to each object in our preservation bucket, because the S3 keys for those items end up being a pair tree checksum, just like Fedora binaries. So we store the original file name for preservation purposes as S3 metadata. And the description is more for just internal tracking purposes. So you can give yourself kind of hints as to what these things are. And then we have AM and PM roles, so access and preservation roles for our works. So yeah, it's a really simple spreadsheet. There's not any descriptive metadata to speak of. A lot of times we'll have scanned many thousands of records or digital objects for a collection, and they don't even have titles and creators and contributors yet. So our whole goal here is to take that material and get it into the system before we even have any descriptive metadata applied to those records. So yeah, here's our spreadsheet. And then this next slide is kind of about how our backend breaks that spreadsheet down and sends it to our pipeline. So on the left-hand side, you see it represents the rows of our spreadsheet. The next column is grouping the rows by work. So that's based on the accession numbers. We kick off progress for each sort of work file set grouping. We create work and file set records and transactions that can succeed or fail together. And then once those things are created, they're sent to the pipeline for processing. So the way that we handle our pipeline is through an Elixir package called Broadway, which allows you to take Amazon SQS messages and pull them to process in Elixir modules. And we wrote at Northwestern a wrapper library around that called Sequins. So the joke is about Broadway and Sequins. And SQS and SNS. So what the job of Sequins in Broadway is to sort of add SNS pub sub to the Broadway pipeline. So we have it has a lot of more opinions about the pipeline than Broadway does. Broadway gives you a lot of flexibility, and we didn't need that flexibility, so we wrote a wrapper around it so that we can have sort of default behavior and not have so much ceremony in our actions that we define for the pipeline. So at a high level, Sequins provides utilities to create queues, topics, and subscriptions that support the pipeline in Amazon SQS and SNS. It allows you to set up the infrastructure. So it creates the queues and topics and subscriptions using the AWS SDK. It defines a standard behavior for pipeline actions. So each action, which I'll go into in a minute, only needs to define one process function that returns a status and optional data. So you do some work and you say either okay, retry, or error, and optional data. In our case, it's usually just the file set ID. It allows for flexible configuration for concurrency. So depending on the system, you can really have a lot of concurrent processes or few, that kind of thing. And it's also a supervised Elixir application with built-in fault tolerance. So it sits in the application supervision tree, and if processes fail, they can be recovered automatically and back to a known good state. So those are the tools that we use to build it out. But then, so the next slide here is a kind of high level visual diagram of what our ingest pipeline looks like. So I'll try to describe it as well as I can. The diagram on the left, we have three vertical columns. On the left, you have the Amazon AWS Simple Queue Service, or SQS. In the middle, you have our Meadow Elixir application. which is using sequence in Broadway for defining our ingest pipeline. So this is code we wrote in the middle. And then on the right, you have Amazon's AWS Simple Notification Service, which is our pub sub topics and subscriptions. So the column on the left is SQS, which is our message queue. Each queue in the column is a producer from which messages are pulled by our application. The center is the ingest pipeline for Meadow and its actions. So at the top, you see the work creator module. It sends file set IDs to the pipeline module, which has a kickoff function that's used to start the processing pipeline for each file set by sending a message to the Meadow ingest file set queue. And then below that are actions that are the quote unquote processes in the system, the parts that do the actual work. So each action updates the file set's progress internally in a database table, does some work, and then sends an update that we use as a basis for publishing WebSocket notifications and power things in the UI. And then after the work is performed, the actions send process data to an SNS topic. So on the right is the AWS Simple Notification Service. So you can see the list of topics: Meadow ingest file set, Meadow generate file set digests, etc. So the actions send messages to topics, which in turn deliver those messages to all subscribers on the topic. In our case, subscribers are the SQS queues in the left-hand column. Importantly, we use subscription filters to send messages back to queues that have a retry status. So if something doesn't work, they can go back to the previous pipeline queue and retry. Otherwise, messages are sent to the next queue in the pipeline. Though we haven't implemented it yet, it would be actually pretty trivial to add other subscribers such as AWS Lambdas, arbitrary webhooks, or even email or SMS messages who wouldn't want to receive a text message each time a pyramid TIFF is created in a batch of 20,000 file sets. So in the next demonstration, I'm going to kind of show what I showed in the first animation, but this time sort of peek under the hood a little bit to see how our GraphQL subscriptions can be monitored through the graphical playground. And we'll see a little bit more about the actions that are being performed on the file sets for a particular ingest sheet. So you can see on the left is the front end, and on the right is our graphical playground. So you can see the ingest progress all the way at the right-hand side. So there's 41, 62 completed actions, 49% complete. And so you can actually see the GraphQL subscriptions through a user interface, which is then used to power that progress bar in the React component on the left. So our system has sort of allowed us to have the ability to see a lot more information and at different levels than we have ever had before. So you can interact with these APIs through command line interfaces, through these UIs, and yeah, so we have a lot more visibility and information than we've ever had in terms of our processing pipelines. So it's been really great. And then I'll sort of end with a little bit of to-dos. Like all we have left is really to finish up our batch editing that Karen mentioned in the previous presentation. We're about 80% done with that. And then we have to deal with eDTF dates because there's no eDTF implementation for Elixir. So we're probably going to use what's called an Elixir port to call out to the eDTF.js library so that we can meet our metadata specialist needs in terms of dates. But besides that, we're right on the edge of launching probably within the next few weeks or so. And that's all I had. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brendan. It was a really great presentation. There are two questions. One is
sure.
more like a comment. So April is saying, I have used InVision to help with generating feedback. It allows the interactions to be present when your wireframes, within your wireframes, as if it was the real thing. It's easy to use and get up and running. There's a free account setting, but with limitations. Also, Figma has been really great to use, from low fidelity wireframes to mockups when trying to elicit feedback from all stakeholders, internal or external, through the entire design process. Great presentation. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
And, mhm. And then there's a question from Justin. How does Meadow ensure digital preservation? Are you relying on S3 entirely?
Right now we are relying on S3 entirely, and we're going to be using the geographic distribution features of S3 for that. And we also have local Isilon storage, but it's just gone through a pretty massive upgrade. And so that's definitely in the queue for work coming up, is replication down to on-site Isilon storage at the university. So yeah, we generally think of digital preservation as more things that humans do, and sort of allow people to make good digital preservation decisions based on information in the system. So one of the things that our users definitely ask about is, can I make sure that the file is in the preservation bucket by just looking at the UI, things like that. And we've definitely been talking about Amazon's new fixity checking service that they just launched in the past few weeks. So we're looking at implementing those features. And yeah, thanks for your question, Justin.
Mhm. Thank you. There's one more question. Do you utilize a shared design library for your React components between your Meadow application and your digital collections app? If so, how do you manage that code from a single source?
I hope maybe Adam's still online and he can maybe answer the question about our component library. I have definitely less interaction with that aspect of things on the project. I'm more on the Elixir backend side of things, but we do have a whole system in place for managing our React components. And Justin, I can definitely link you the notice that went out recently about the Fixity service. I'll do that right after this.
Okay, thanks. There's one more question by Justin. Can you link to the Fixity service from Amazon in Slack, please?
Sure thing. Yep.
There was a question in Slack, and I'm not sure if it is already answered in Slack. Let's see. Oh, there's one more question here from Matt. Do you utilize a shared design library for your React components between your Meadow applications and your digital collection app? If so, how do you manage that code from a single source?
Oh yeah, that's
We
the
already
one I
answered
mentioned.
this, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just click on answer live.
Cool.
And it's done. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, Trey asked a question in Slack and it was answered there.
All right.
So I guess we don't have any other questions. We have a minute or so if anyone else has a question.
Yep, we're on Slack all the time. So if anybody wants to talk about deployment, infrastructure, Elixir, any of that stuff, I'm game anytime.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you so much, Brandon. It was really great. It was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yep, it's time for a break until 12:10. And we will be back at 12:10. 10 minutes break, and then after that we have 3 more presentations. So we'll see you all in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Next up, we have Abigail, Shelton, and Rob Fox.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, great. All right, hi everyone. My name is Abby Shelton and I work at the Snipe Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague, Rob Fox. So Rob, if you just want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Rob Fox. I'm the manager of one of the software development units within Hesburgh Library at Notre Dame.
So we're both new to the Samvera conference, so really excited to be here and share an ongoing project with you all. So in this session, we're going to talk about connection, how we're connecting people and applications to provide access to our digital collections at the University of Notre Dame. I'll start by talking a little bit about those human connections, and then Rob will follow to describe more of the technology links. So just to set some context, like many projects, probably all of you are involved with, this one really started with a grant. So in 2017, the university received a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to create a unified digital space for archival, library, and museum collections. So what you're seeing on the slide is a nice compilation of objects from those campus partners. And this was really filling a need for all three campus units. The art museum on campus where I work had no online catalog for its collections, and the university archives and library had no real centralized place for their digitized items. Some of those items are spread across some boutique digital exhibits, sites, and then others were housed in our institutional repository. So while the grant was written like many grants with a pretty broad mandate, and a worthy goal, provide unified access to these collections, which really have a lot of overlapping themes and uses. We quickly discovered, of course, a pretty fundamental challenge, which was that our digital files, our metadata, and our people were squirreled away in various silos, both human and technological. So the way we approached this was not to migrate everything to a new system, but instead build and strengthen connections across our human and tech ecosystem to make these collections more accessible and usable to our community. I want to acknowledge that we're not the first to take more of a modular approach. There have been some really great recent articles in the Code for Lib journal, for instance. And also there was a really wonderful Open Repositories presentation last year by the University of Denver, who are taking a little more of this approach. So our project goals, as encapsulated here on the slide, again, were pretty broad, as many grants are. Basically, we wanted to get more digitized content out into the world. We wanted to work together better as a museum and a library. And we wanted to experiment with some new to us technologies like IIIF and Amazon Web Services. Because we didn't have any concrete technical deliverables, i.e., the platform had to function in a certain way, to further define our goals, we went immediately to our community, which I'll talk about next. And you see a logo here on the slide. In case you hear us refer to MARBLE, that's the name or acronym for this project. And it stands for Museums, Archives, Rare Books, and Libraries Exploration. So although we were working under this grant mandate, and we do think about what the grant means, our starting premise wasn't really what does the grant say we have to deliver, but instead what does our community need? So the flashy bits of our community engagement looked like this. The picture you see on the slide is me talking to a student. We did some kind of flash user experience testing last fall where we offered donuts and other treats to students walking by in our library lobby in exchange for their observations, obviously pre-COVID. But the majority of our community engagement has looked like sitting in faculty offices, staff cubicles, campus coffee shops, and classrooms with over 100 students over the course of this project to listen to what they have to say about using collections online. And in the first year of the project, we did sort of an initial round of those conversations to ask people about their kind of basic use cases. And to some extent, the answers that we received weren't all that surprising to us, but good to confirm what we sort of already knew. For instance, one of the major requests from our faculty users was wanting to find lectures or images to use in lecture notes or PowerPoint presentations. And then, a big request from students was wanting to find materials for class assignments or refinding images of objects that they had seen during a class visit. So after these initial rounds of community conversations, we took the information we had gleaned and we went through a series of not unfamiliar steps. It was great to hear Northwestern's presentation this morning because I think we did a lot of similar things. So it's great to see others are thinking in the same way. So we began by prototyping even on paper, as you see here in the upper left, and getting feedback on our early wireframes, which were very basic. And then we built several iterations of an alpha prototype and put them in front of people. So you see in the lower part of the slide, an image of me sitting with an undergraduate student using the site. And then we've built towards a beta over the last year doing some of those similar steps. So we've gone through a testing cycle about every semester, sometimes multiple times a semester, using both formal and informal methods. So every semester we'll do a very sort of formal recruitment effort with students to sit down in sort of one-on-one sessions, but then we also will show, paper or PDF copies of user interface designs to colleagues, as we see them. We have pivoted completely to online testing as of March, and we are currently testing with students this semester completely online. So we've used LibWizard, which is a SpringShare product, mostly used for teaching and instruction, but we've used it to create an asynchronous testing module that students can complete on their own time. So I won't go into the specifics of what we've found since we only have a few minutes, but I do think that this connection with the community has been crucial for our team. And I think Northwestern also highlighted some of these points, so that's great. For this project, we've really seen how integrating user experience work into our normal workflow as a software development team has really grounded us. So instead of, jumping ahead to build a finished product, we've really tested things, whether it's features or page layouts, as they've been built so that we can confirm and improve upon those as we go. We decided after those early conversations with users to focus on the student experience. This wasn't to exclude other groups, but sort of the mindset that if we could make this digital collection site useful to our more novice users, then others would find it intuitive as well. And this has helped us prioritize some features that were most important to students, particularly the ability to browse and do keyword searching. We've also seen this mindset sort of spread to other teams involved in the project. For instance, at the museum, in our metadata work, I've started to see our curators begin to reference user needs in a way that perhaps they haven't done before. So they're now thinking about applying keywords to these terms that would help students search and find objects rather than relying on really specialist knowledge or jargon. So speaking of our colleagues, how have we been engaging them as collaborators around these community needs? We realized pretty early on that we needed to enlist broader institutional support for this effort. So we formed 4 different project teams, which I've listed on the slide: content to focus on content selections, metadata to resolve some metadata issues, workflow to create or improve existing digitization workflows for the library and museum, and then the software development team. Speaking of the development team, one of the most significant things I think we've done is place a developer on all of these teams. So they're able to provide more of a technical perspective, but also just to listen kind of unfiltered to the needs of their colleagues. So I'm going to focus for a minute on the metadata and workflows team, since I think some of our strongest cross-departmental connections have happened there. So our metadata team is composed of folks from the library and the museum. All of the teams are actually composed of folks from the library and the museum. Has really been central to the project. So they've built a really incredible metadata mapping document, spreadsheet, that maps the metadata found in our museum collections management system, which is we're using Embark, our archive space instance, which is used by our archives department, and then Aleph, which is our library catalog. The mapping spreadsheet really has been the foundation for allowing us to make connections across collections and allowed each department to maintain its own best metadata practices, but then allow the end user to navigate across those collections. We'd be happy to share that at any point if anyone here is interested. In addition, this team has been really great in pivoting and moving to respond to user needs. So once we heard from students about the importance of kind of big, broad keyword searching, browsing functionality, this team has been working on enhancing the keywords that are already attached to our objects. So they've been mining the Library of Congress and Getty hierarchies to include related terms, so that we can really facilitate that searching and browsing that students were after. And then the workflows team is also composed of colleagues from both departments. And the work I want to just mention briefly from them that I think has been really instrumental in that connection piece has been the rights conversations, which are really super in progress right now. We're currently working on a decision tree that empowers content managers to make some decisions about when and how to share collections information with our copyright experts. But I think this has been a point where the museum has learned from the library and vice versa. So for the museum, from our perspective, we're much more free, feel much more free to share copyrighted works online. I think the library has, not that they're fully ready to put copyrighted works online, but they have definitely become more open to the idea where, a fair use argument might be made. On the other hand, I think the library has been really interested in using unified rights statements like rightstatements.org, and also really open access designations for public domain works, where the museum previously was interested in putting some more restrictions on those objects. So we haven't quite worked out the differences between each unit, but I think this has been a team where we've really learned from each other in that respect. So that was really quick and at a high level, but I'm happy to talk more at a later time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rob to talk about some of the ways that we approached the technology side of the project.
Thank you, Abby. As you can imagine, with a project of this scope, which we had not really tackled previously, the multi-sourcing of data, since we decided early on in this project that we wanted to take advantage of the existing workflows and the existing expertise from the museum, from the library, and folks within archives. So multi-sourcing into a system like this is definitely one of those major challenges. Another challenge that we have is that we do not have a formal digital asset management system currently in place with the library or with Notre Dame at all. So that means that any of the original object files that we wanted to use and in-source into the system are stored in multiple locations. And that presents a logistical problem for us, for sure. And then finally, and this is true, I think, for every single organization that would have a system like this, but data curation, record curation, and the management of metadata, as you know, is not always consistent. It's not always well maintained, or it's incomplete. In some cases, it's entirely missing. We had certain cases where the collection level metadata is stored in one system of record, and the item level metadata is stored in a completely different system of record. And we have to figure out ways of trying to wed that data together, which is a challenge all on its own. Next. I'm going to go very briefly into the different parts of the architecture for Marble. And if you have any questions after this, any detailed technical questions, we're going to provide our contact information. But there's a lot that I'm going to cover here, and I'm going to do it very quickly. We've broken up the architecture of Marble into several sub-processes or several sub-pipelines. And the first of those pipelines that we decided to decouple early on was the image processing pipeline, because it has its own set of challenges. And in the diagram that I'm showing here on the left, there are two ways of sourcing image files into this image pipeline. We use the metadata from the source system to try to determine if we have a pointer to an image, and then we use that pointer to ingest it into the image processing pipeline. Sometimes we have to rely on storage systems in the background that are not tied to the metadata at all. And those also source the image processing pipeline. Then we go into two steps that run in parallel. The first step is, of course, we have to create various derivatives of each of the images. And so that's done at that step. And then also, as a side process, we are making a copy of the original with the hopes that in the future we will be able to feed that to some sort of preservation system, which we do not currently have in place, but we are taking that step currently. After all of the derivatives are created, then they go into a shared storage system, which right now is an S3 bucket in AWS. And that shared storage area is accessed by a IIIF image service. This is actually based on code that we got from Northwestern. So thank you to Northwestern for that, that we've been refactoring and using as our IIIF image service. And then the front end then will access that IIIF image service to look at the pointers and then pull the images into the front end UI. Next. The second major processing pipeline that we have is the metadata processing pipeline. And as Abby indicated, we are sourcing from several different systems. We have three canonical systems that we're currently sourcing from. One is Embark, which is used by the museum. The second is Aleph, which is the library integrated system. Then we also source from ArchiveSpace for archives related content and RBSC related content. And then we have a couple of ad hoc methods that we use where we are sourcing from non-canonical systems. So that could be a file system or a one-time harvest from a particular source. And I will mention that one of the systems that falls within this ad hoc area is our institutional repository, which is Curate. We had a very difficult time harvesting from Curate, mainly because harvesting took so long. It could take up to a day and a half to harvest one collection of a couple thousand items. So we only did that once or twice in getting the metadata into this processing pipeline. The second step is normalization. And this is where we take advantage of that spreadsheet that Abby mentioned that maps from the source system to the fields that we want to use in Marble. And then the next step is data enrichment. And Abby also mentioned that this step is using several different sources that are industry standard that we use to enhance the quality of the records. And some of those include the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, the Getty Iconography Authority, and the Library of Congress subject terms. If there are subject-related fields in the source record, we will also use those to enhance the metadata and make the discovery process much richer. The next step is a serialization process that takes all of this aggregated data from the previous two steps And then we normalize that out into something that we call standard JSON. And so we use that standard JSON further down in some of the other processing steps to actually build the site. So that standard JSON is then also stored out in S3. Next. The site builder is also completely decoupled from the other two pipelines that I talked about. And the central technology that we're using within this component is a product called Gatsby. Gatsby can use React code to aggregate data by querying a data source, and we use GraphQL to do that. So Gatsby will query various data sources. In this case, we have a metadata store that refers back to the previous pipeline for metadata, and it will query that as a data source, ingest that data, and then it has the ability to create static site pages. So this is important for a couple of reasons. It's important for performance in some ways, and it's also important for search engine optimization, because that was a major concern that we had going into this project. So Gatsby will then produce several different types of static pages. It produces general site pages such as the home page, etc. It produces result fragments. So when someone does a search within the search interface, then the results that come back, each of those results is a result fragment. And so we pre-render that so that it performs better. We also produce collection level pages and then item level pages. But there is still a large piece of the application on the front end that uses React in a dynamic way. So there are still dynamic aspects of the site as well. It's not completely static. Those pages then go into a page store, and then the parent SPA will either call a pre-rendered page or a pre-rendered fragment, or use the dynamic functionality to render the page. Next. Redbox. Redbox was not something that we originally planned on at the beginning of this project, but it is a stopgap measure in order to solve some of the problems that we encountered related to the sourcing of metadata, and also the relations between the descriptive metadata and the item level records. The name actually comes from our process diagrams as we were discussing and mapping out how the system was going to work. There were certain areas of functionality that we knew that we needed, but we weren't sure how we were going to achieve that. And so in that area of the diagram, we would draw a red box. This has nothing to do with the video renting service at all. On the left of this diagram there, you can see that Redbox draws on two different data sources. One is the metadata store that I talked about earlier. Actually, Redbox uses a sidecar metadata store to pull on, and then also the images that have been processed via the image pipeline. The user interface for Redbox allows curators to see a list of collections of metadata, and then also images that are stored in the image store, and then they can connect or associate those two types of records, and also choose a default image, excuse me, for that particular record or for that particular collection. So this allows them to do record association, which is the next two boxes on the diagram, and also record enhancement. So we have not implemented this yet, but this would also allow curators to enhance records that have incomplete descriptive metadata associated with them. Then this is processed and put back into the metadata store, and then the site builder then queries this unified or aggregated metadata store to build the site. Next, future challenges. One of the commitments that we made early in the project, which is a huge challenge for us, and we're still not sure how we're going to handle this, is that we do have a commitment to open source the components of Marble, but obviously that will be a challenge trying to attract potential adopters and then also building a community of contribution. So, so that will be a future challenge for us. Data sourcing is going to continue to be a challenge for us because we need to write adapters for every source system that we harvest from. The library is planning on getting a new integrated library system within the next couple of years, and so we will have to completely rewrite that adapter. And then also we need to solve problems, for example, with Curate, where it's very difficult to harvest metadata from them. And so we need to try to solve those problems as well. An ongoing issue for us, and we've talked about this previously a little bit, is of course metadata quality and trying to get good, well-maintained metadata records in the various canonical systems, and also creating new metadata for records that do not exist. And so that will be an ongoing challenge. And then any software system becomes dead the minute that you stop maintaining it. So continuous improvement is something that we now try to commit to rigorously for any new project that we take on. So this is where we, we have a method that we use in software development at Notre Dame where we're always working closely with product owners and the users of the system to make sure that the functionality of the system is still relevant. So we have that challenge of trying to maintain those connections and then also continuously improving the source code of the system itself. And then also getting those commitments from organizations around the university that contribute content to Marble to make sure that we're getting that steady flow of data into Marble. And that's all I have, and I can turn it back over to Abby.
Yeah, so we wanted to include our contact information here if you have any questions or want to talk further. And I think we've left maybe a couple of minutes for questions.
Thanks, Abigail and Rob. We don't have any questions in the Q&A section here. There might be some trickling in the Slack channel that we can keep an eye on. But we do have a few minutes. If anybody has a question, please do post here.
While the questions are coming in, we also have a project microsite there. So if you're interested in just looking at what we have so far, that would be the link.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It would be nice to add that link to the Slack channel if you can.
Sure. I am not on the Slack channel, but I will get on there and we can add it. I think we also have some Notre Dame team members who are probably on that who could do it as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, and you can even post it here on the chat as well if you can do that. So there is one question. Is there time for a quick demo? Which I don't know if it would be possible. I'm answering it on your behalf. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if the person is referring to the front end or the back end, but if you contact me, I'm happy to send you a link to our beta version of the site if you're interested in seeing how the front end works. In terms of some of the back end processes, I'm sure we'd be happy to show those as well. So just get in touch with us and we can arrange that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. There's another question from John Wise. Will you be expanding to include more content sources?
That would be our eventual hope. So we have some other campus partners that I think we would like to involve. Other departments on campus that have collections, and we anticipate that they would have their own collection management database. So I think that's our hope and intention. We don't have any, we're sort of sticking with the major 3 sources for this scope of this project, which we're hoping to launch the site next year, and then the grant will end next summer. And then we'll look into what those future integrations might be.
Thank you. There's one more, and we'll do this quickly because it's almost time. Question from Alberto Martinez. Not sure if I missed it, but where in the workflow are you assigning pearls?
Oh, that's a great question. We are not actually doing that at this moment. Am I right in saying that, Rob? That's definitely
that's correct.
Yeah, that's something that we're interested in doing, but have not done yet.
Okay, that sounds good. There are a few more questions coming in. If you can answer it in the Q&A section,
Sure.
That would be great. Now is the time for a presentation from Esme and Kim. And thank you so much, Abigail and Rob, for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right, now I'm unmuted and you are seeing my slides, I think.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right, great. So I'm Esme Coles, and I'm here to talk about shifting gears, about what digital projects look like when you can't digitize anything. So before COVID, we had a lot of work to do, but we really felt like we had a great team. We had a great platform for doing digital projects and digitization. The core of that was our repository for building objects. That's our Samvera application Figgy. We had a IIIF ecosystem to make that viewer based on those objects in the repository and have that show up in the repository so you can review things as you work on them and also show up in the front end of the applications. Both our sort of bread and butter, catalog and finding aids discovery applications and more focused ones like our Maps portal or our digital collection site based on Spotlight. And we were syncing metadata for the most part, where if we had metadata in the finding aid or in Mark, we were able to sync that metadata around. But we definitely had some pain points. We built workflows for review and approval that had never really been worked, never really used the way we'd planned for them to be used, I guess I would say. A lot of things were ingested and then sort of bulk approved and pushed out. Definitely a lot of technical debt, a lot of sort of one-off applications and access applications floating around. Everybody was really busy, both in IT and across the library. And a particular problem we had identified is that metadata conservation and IT work were really underestimated as part of that process. That we felt like we had a good ability to estimate and prioritize the digitization work sort of narrowly defined, but that penumbra of supporting work always seemed to get underestimated. And we had begun to work on that. We had sort of revised our project proposal process and had a call for proposals that would require metadata and conservation sign-off and department head sign-off for prioritization. And that call for proposals was due on April 10th, which, just for reference for anybody, that was the height of the first wave of COVID in New Jersey. So when COVID hit, there was a brief period of time where we were just trying to scramble and figure out how to work. A lot of our staff in IT had been working from home, either full-time remote workers or occasional teleworkers, and so that was not such a big concern. But a lot of our staff across the library had never worked from home, and so just figuring out who needed a laptop, whether people could work from home, negotiating with the union about what that looked like, was a huge amount of the focus. And then starting to think about everything else, like, well, we have digitization workflows that involve shipping hard drives around. Well, shipping and receiving got hard when our campus mailroom was overwhelmed and our library mailrooms were closed. We also spent some time just trying to help newly remote staff adjust, so reaching out to people, offering our expertise, and sharing our experiences. And After a couple of weeks of that mode, I would say it really began to sink in that this was not a short-term thing, that this was going to be a long-term situation that we would need to live with. And so we started asking ourselves, what do digital projects look like if we're closed indefinitely? And we weren't closed indefinitely. We were closed for a few months, and by the summer, we were open again in a limited capacity. But to the degree that we were open, it was for pickup and digitization focused really on teaching and research. And so there really, even now, is very little bandwidth for digitization for sort of discretionary, curator-driven digital projects, exhibits, a lot of the things that used to drive the majority of our digitization. So I wouldn't say that we're in a world with zero digitization, but very little. And that's sort of where we expect to be. So I wanted to talk today about sort of how we've reacted to that and share some of our thoughts and some of our ideas. And I really hope to hear in the questions and later on what other people have been up to, because I'm sure everybody has reacted to this in a million ways. So the first thing we worked on was the stuff that was digitized but hadn't really made it through the whole process or was languishing in an old system. We still had some old applications, exhibits, an old version of our digital library platform, various things that had been photographed and never ingested. So there was a lot of content that we could revisit to do the metadata work, to do the ingest work, whatever needed to be done. And as we revisited some of those, we found that a lot of change had happened. In some cases, there were staff changes that had happened. And the new curators were more flexible and open to different ideas. We also found that the new imperative to make content accessible really changed how people interacted with us and what they were open to. In the past, I think there was a really high expectation of being able to have things be perfect. And given that the highest priority of the library was making as much content available as possible to support teaching and research, I think there was a feeling that it was okay if it wasn't perfect. We didn't have to resolve every single issue. It was enough to get things up online good enough. We also found some new possibilities for collaboration. A lot of our staff all of our staff at the beginning were working from home and couldn't do everything that they could normally do. And so we're looking for work or had availability and bandwidth to work on things that in the past would not have been possible. And in some cases, it had been a year or more since we had talked to people or revisited a project. And in those situations, we found that, in some cases, the application functionality had improved enough that we could now handle things that we couldn't have handled before. So that let us move a couple of projects along. One of the ones I'm sort of most grateful for being able to move along is our Western Americana collection. It's our biggest photography collection. And it had been stuck for years because it had photo albums with both pictures of the photo pages with sometimes multiple pages and marginalia and legends and things. But it also had photographs of each individual photograph. And we kind of struggled with how to represent that and the work necessary to make that work well. And the new curator said, you know what, we really need to get this collection up. It's untenable to not have this in our new system. Let's just do the photographs and we'll worry about the books later. We were also able to move forward with a new version of our performance archive that was a digital audio application that replaced an old Access application. So that was great to move forward. We did some development work to support that and other ingest. Things like we'd had persistent problems with Google Drive upload not working, which some of our users were using. And we had a hard time debugging that because the developers who were mostly working on that functionality could not reproduce the problem. But a lot of people, including myself, got it 100% of the time. It just didn't work. But we added drag and drop ingest to the repository, which gave people another sort of easy to use functionality that didn't require using a staging server. We were working on migrating a number of our collections from special collections, which led us to improve the metadata extraction. So when we synchronized metadata from our EADs, we did a better job of extracting properties. And when we did start scanning, we really had a lot of people who were not used to using the repository, scanning content that was going into the repository to support course reserves. So we automated PDF ingest, so taking PDFs, splitting them apart into page images, and automatically assigning them the right collections and things. And that really helped people ingest a lot more and maximize the scanning time in the library. We also spent some time enriching existing content. So when I mentioned those workflows that never really worked, one of those was that we really expected that catalogers and curators would review and enrich and approve content sort of in a pretty manual, hands-on process. And that's just not really the way things worked in practice. But because we had a lot of staff who were working from home who needed work to do, we put those people to work working on adding page numbers, adding tables of contents, just going through and looking at things, identified problems that needed to be resolved. And so that was mostly work that IT coordinated and supported, but staff throughout the library were working on. We did add some features to support that work to make the workflow work for that sort of work a little bit better, especially because there were a lot of people in different groups working together, and so we wanted to avoid duplication. So we added some facets to our repository to identify things that had structure or didn't, so you could identify things that needed to be improved. A date limit in our repository. We had that in some of our user-facing apps before, but never in the repository. So adding that so that you could find, for example, public domain content that could easily be made public if it had been finished and approved. And then a claim feature. So instead of our first approach to that was making spreadsheets and assigning objects for different people to work on. But we quickly switched to having a button for people to claim things. So you could tell if a thing was claimed or not, and if it was claimed by you. And so that would let you sort of coordinate with a large group of people and not have people stepping on each other's toes. And so a lot of our work in IT, and this is mostly Kim Lehman, my co-author here as our IT project manager, really working with a lot of staff, explaining the purpose and the benefits of this work, explaining the usability benefits of having a table of contents in a book to make it more navigable and things like that. Providing training and workflow documentation so that people knew what to do, answering questions when people had them, and coordinating staff from multiple departments. A lot of the staff were either in the general collections departments or in the studio, and a lot of the content came from our special collections department. And so just making sure that people could work across departments, coordinate and collaborate effectively was a big part of it. And so the benefits we saw from this were a couple of expected benefits, like making our digital objects more usable, and allowing staff who are working from home to make a concrete contribution toward a high priority for the library. Those are sort of the reasons why we started this work, but some of the other benefits were maybe not as obvious, like a number of our staff speak various languages that we have content in, and they were able to put their language skills to use when working with these materials. Some of our staff were using the repository to ingest content and then didn't really know the rest of the application. And so this gave them a chance to learn more about the application, use sort of the rest of the workflow. And one of the things that was most surprising and really heartening to me was having staff report that they really appreciated being part of a team, working together in groups to tackle a project and work through a collection and get all of the objects paginated was something that people found really rewarding. So in addition to those sort of getting new content going, we also worked with special collections, particularly on reusing existing content. We built a Spotlight exhibit to explain how to build Spotlight exhibits in our Spotlight instance, digital PUL. We provided a lot of training and individual support too, so it wasn't just documentation, but it was really working with them to streamline the workflow, to make it easier to select things from multiple collections, In the past, the vast majority of our exhibits had been based on a single collection and really driven by either a topical sort of collection or focus within that collection, or driven by an exhibit, also very thematic and focused on a single collection most of the time. And so identifying things from across different collections was a big part of that. And obviously a lot of training and outreach to sort of encourage people to do this kind of work and to brainstorm with them how to make that process easier so that they could sort of use the wealth of content that we already had. And we're really happy about having a couple of exhibits come out of that, including this one, Hope for the Open Country, just talking about the urban parks movement, which we thought was a great thing to pull things from a couple of different collections together. And then there's sort of a few other things that I wanted to talk about, different kinds of collaborations. We had one collection that had a sort of outsourced metadata creation. This is our South Asian ephemera collection that had a vendor in India that wanted to access our system and add metadata. And to some degree, we had that in place, but there was definitely some work there to make that all work in coordinating all of that, and some recently added features around restricting certain kinds of contributors to a single collection so that they could work with just the collection they were contracted to work on, a save draft feature to let people sort of add incomplete metadata and have somebody else sort of have that handed off to them and finish it and publish it. We also had some vendors transition. One of the vendors we were working with and had several collections in process went out of business and was required by another vendor. And so there was a lot of back and forth about how our materials were being handled and moving things over to the new vendor that was going to assume that project. We talked to a lot of faculty members about a lot of things, especially early in the spring. We had some ideas about working on annotations and transcription projects and other things for the fall. We didn't really embark on any big software development efforts in those areas. We mostly wound up using things that we already had in place. But there was a lot of discussion and a lot of openness, I think, to exploring different ways of doing things that we hope will bear fruit in the coming years. And we've also had some staff scanning and transcribing at home. So the image here is one from our bird journal collection. A naturalist who was just taking censuses of birds that he saw, and we had photographed all of those, but this is really a data set in the making, and so there was a lot of transcription work to turn those into usable data that staff could do from home. We also worked with a couple of different platforms on getting our collections out into the world and other places where users might find them. We sort of improved support for Oai Harvesting. One of the main projects that made use of that was the France in the Americas project, which is being run by the BNF to collect materials about France, French experience in the Americas, and also made some improvements for our Digital Chicken Yara, another multi-institution project that we participate in. We've begun contributing some of our manuscript objects to the OPEN repository, which mostly involved metadata review and some metadata enhancement, and just coordinating with the OPEN folks. And then prioritizing digitization. To the degree that digitization requests kept coming in, we did some work to just figure out which of those were really instructional in nature and which ones were not, and sort of separate those out and help prioritize which ones needed immediate attention. And so the bottom line for me is that a lot of this work really improved access to our collections. It made content that was hidden or in older systems and hard to find more visible, easier to discover. It made some of the content that was already public easier to work with. It helped a lot of our staff be productive and make a real contribution to important work that was going on in those early months, especially. And we really built some relationships and encouraged collaboration across the library. That's sort of a strategic goal for our library overall. And so we were really happy to encourage that kind of collaboration across different kinds of departments. So that is my presentation. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Esme. There are a few questions in this channel. First one is, what sort of IT work was underestimated? Infrastructure, DevOps, things like provisioning and deploying?
I would say the biggest category is the building and operation of exhibits. We have a Spotlight instance, and we'd sort of built that assuming that people were going to, that our curators and librarians were going to use that functionality to build their own exhibits. But what we found was that a lot of exhibits wound up being made as sort of offshoots of physical exhibits, and the work translating the physical exhibit materials into the digital exhibit wound up being pushed onto IT because the curators didn't have the time or the skills to do that work. And the other category of IT work that I think was really underestimated was when there wasn't a feature, when there was feature work that needed to be done in order to support a new content type or a new workflow wrinkle or a new metadata source. I think there was often not an understanding of how that work was, or a good way of bringing that into the proposal process. So I think that's always a work in process.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good, thanks. Next question is by Robin. She's asking, has Princeton considered using Spotlight to enable non-librarians to build focused collection exhibits? For example, students or faculty?
We have one of those faculty collaborations that I mentioned is with a faculty member who has a number of grad students working on a project, and they're working on building an exhibit right now. We don't really expect that to go live in Spotlight. We expect that to be a data source for another application. So that's maybe not the best example. We have been talking with our museum and our teaching and learning center, the McGraw Center, about student work and students, especially in classes, integrating materials both from the library and the museum and our art and archaeology department. And so we've thought about whether our Spotlight instance would be a good platform for bringing those things together. To a large degree, I think we felt like there's a lot of different use cases in that Spotlight application, where it has both sort of digital copies of physical exhibits and some of these thematic things, and maybe digital collections more broadly. And so we're a little hesitant about expanding it to student work, but it's definitely a thing we've thought about.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. Next question is by Meredith Hale. And the question is, can you elaborate on what you mean by improve OAI? Just make sure that all collections like France and the Americas are present in OAI.
Sure. When we built our OAI support, which was actually very recent, it only supported items that had MARC records, because the main project we built it for was the Chicken Yara project, where all of the items had MARC records. So one of the big things was making sure that it would support any kind of records and generate Dublin core metadata, at least for everything, so that anything that was in our repository could be harvested over OAI.
Okay. Thank you for answering all these questions. We have a few more minutes if anyone else has any question. Or Esme, if you want to reiterate on anything else.
No, I think I had everything that I wanted to say in my presentation. So unless there's any more questions, I'd be happy to give people 5 minutes.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So yeah, let's do that. We will take 15 minutes break until 1:20. And thank you, Esme, so much for the great presentation and answering all the questions. So we'll see you all in 15 minutes around 1:20. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you all enjoyed your 15 minutes break. We have James Griffin for the next presentation, followed by interest group and working group updates. After you, James.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen? Perfect, thank you. So, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be taking some time in order to discuss some work that I've been involved in prototyping and testing with it in the Princeton University Library regarding cloud storage and its integration and support within Valkyrie repositories. Sorry. So firstly, to introduce myself, my name is James Griffin. I'm a digital infrastructure developer in the Princeton University Library. As such, I'm also a member of the Samvera community. I have some level of involvement with the core component maintenance working group, as well as the Browse Everything interest group. I'll be addressing those in a little bit more detail further in the presentation. And I thought that I might also take this time to very briefly define what Valkyrie is. I believe that there was already a presentation led by my colleague Trey Pendragon addressing the Valkyrie project, but to basically reduce it to a number of essential attributes. It's a Ruby software library, a gem, which basically provides for adopters a series of storage mechanisms that can be readily integrated into Samvera repository applications. Basically, what Valkyrie allows one to do is basically provide a series of plugins through which one can readily store the files or metadata that is being managed and saved and persisted within a Samvera repository application itself. As it is a Samvera project, it is open source, and hence custom adapters and experimentation are quite welcome for this. So basically focus, what is it exactly that I'm going to be addressing in this presentation? Well, cloud storage really has a number of different meanings, and to really provide a kind of much more narrow context for this, I'm going to be speaking to cloud storage really at the level of Samvera repositories and the actual persistence of files and metadata within these Ruby on Rails applications. For those who are familiar with the Hyrex project, essentially up until the introduction and popularization of the Valkyrie gem, Fedora Commons, a separate but also open source application, has been used to serve as the primary persistence solution for saving not only binary files, but also metadata associated with these files. And it has been this standalone Java application that has been used to write primarily to one's own storage solution. So basically, one would use Fedora Commons to sort of save the actual file or collection of files within a Samvera repository. And a very common configuration for Fedora Commons is that one would be writing directly to the file system on the server in which the Fedora Commons Java application happens to be deployed. The interface through which Fedora Commons is actually communicating to the Samvera repository is the active Fedora gem, which itself is a Ruby on Rails project, an open source Samvera project and component. So typically, one finds that these types of standardized persistence strategies are employed in the architecture for Samvera solution bundles. Hyrax and Avalon Media System are the two that come to mind. Basically, Hyrax and Avalon have readily used active Fedora along with Fedora Commons to kind of utilize writing to the file system via Ruby and this Java application. The introduction of Valkyrie, however, has kind of introduced the possibility of exploring different pluggable storage backends. Within the Princeton University Library, we happen to have a standalone Samvera repository, which is not based off of these solution bundles. We have this custom Valkyrie-based implementation of a repository known as Figgy. And this has been implemented by my colleagues and myself, members of the Digital Repository and Discovery Services team. In addition to this, it should also be noted that Hyrax 3.0 will begin to support Valkyrie as an option for backend storage, but will also support active Fedora as a method of persistence as well to support those who are still using Fedora Commons within their application stack. So how does any of the Samvera repository architecture relate to cloud storage then, based upon what we've already discussed? Well, to really narrowly define cloud storage for this presentation, I'm going to be referencing cloud storage services that are typically used by users and users employing or utilizing a JavaScript-based user interface using a browser. So really, cloud storage solutions here are going to be Google Drive, Dropbox, Microsoft OneDrive. There's also going to be some discussion of the usage of Amazon Simple Storage Service S3 buckets or Google Storage buckets. But we're not going to be addressing any cloud storage solutions that are low level. So outside of the scope of this conversation is Gluster, Ceph, or Swift, which are really solutions for private clouds running on solutions like OpenStack. It should also be referenced here that I have briefly overviewed Fedora Commons. Fedora itself is not a private cloud. There is, as I've mentioned, it by default writes directly to the file system on which it's been deployed in its server environment. There are some configuration options that allow you to persist it to a cloud-based storage solution, but again, that's not going to be discussed in this presentation. And Valkyrie itself is a series of storage adapters. So it in itself isn't really opinionated as to which storage adapter you happen to be using. By default, what we happen to be using in the Princeton University Library for Figgy, we're using the file system storage adapter to persist binary files. And we're using a separate storage adapter for persisting metadata into a relational database. So if we're going to be looking to support basically integrating content from Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive into a given repository, Fedora is not going to serve as a solution. Valkyrie storage adapters, possibly one could be written that's customized, but we're still left with the problem of basically user interface support. Fedora itself has a web-based client, but it primarily offers just web APIs over REST. And Valkyrie is a gem, so it's basically just, it's Ruby. There's no actual user interface offered at all. So given all of the requirements that we've thus far identified, we'd also like this to be something that we could use to, well, we would like this to be something that the community itself could repurpose and it could be supported outside of our institution. A candidate solution for this was a project known as Browse Everything. This is a community gem. It's been identified as a core component, meaning that there's it requires a certain amount of routine maintenance applied to it in order to ensure that it's regularly maintained and documented. It also offers a suite of adapters. It's termed internally as drivers for different cloud storage services. And it also does provide a user interface for uploading these files from cloud storage into the repository. So regarding the current status of Browse Everything, this was going to be integrated into Figgy for our usage within the Princeton University Library. Currently, this is integrated into Hyrax 2x releases. I know that this is currently stable for working with file system-based uploads. And I have seen it, I know that it works, at least in some cases, with cloud storage services. But there's a lot of work that's done to basically maintain 1x releases series of these this gem. There is a 2.0 reimplementation that's underway. The global pandemic introduced some significant delays in the implementation for this, and I was heavily involved in the efforts to start to re-implement this. along with other members of the community, most notably Northwestern University, Indiana University, and the University of Cincinnati. For Browse Everything 2.0, the reimplementation is using React, the JavaScript library, to provide a user interface. The Ruby component of the gem is actually being restructured to offer a REST API, and this is documented currently using a project known as Swagger. So if I can just stop the presentation briefly, one can see spinning this up locally. One has the ability to begin to interact using the Swagger API user interface with the endpoints. So getting a bit into the architectural overview of what this is going to look like as one proceeds from the 2.0 reimplementation. The hope is that basically one would be in the position where one could select any number of different cloud storage service providers, and using the Browse Everything REST API, pass this through the entire Samvera repository stack. And in cases where Valkyrie has been integrated, one would then use the metadata that's been passed from Google Drive to persist using the metadata adapter to a relational database like PostgreSQL, or one could, and in this case also for the binary content, the files themselves would pass through the same stack, but in this case be delegated to the storage adapter, which would simply write to a file storage solution. So in order to achieve this, there are some outstanding challenges. Basically, it's quite rewarding and necessary, but still quite labor intensive to rewrite and re-implement Browse Everything for this 2.0 release. It will, however, allow us to address user interface improvements. And it is also going to require quite a significant amount of maintenance for the existing 1X releases for the foreseeable future, until a stable path for full deprecation can really be properly explored. As I started to work to really take what was essentially a fork of Browse Everything in this reimplementation process and start to see how I can work to successfully provide a proof of concept integration with the Princeton Figgy repository, I found that there were really some architectural challenges, or I would say more open-ended questions, and some real ambiguity or degrees of ambiguity that could be found when it comes to addressing supporting a more generic project that could be readily repurposed between different institutions and Samvera member organizations. So it's quite simple to identify use cases for Google Drive or Dropbox. I mean, end users are going to want to basically have an additional user interface on their Samvera repository that allows them to click and select, say, a number of files on Google Drive, or select an entire folder and simply have this ingested into a given collection. However, when it comes to actually implementing this at the software level, how this can be reconciled with the newer Valkyrie architecture, it becomes a bit less obvious. As I was exploring the reimplementation and seeing how it could be integrated with Figgy, some questions that really became apparent to me were whether or not Browse Everything is actually something that should be supported as a standalone gem, or is this something that might actually be more appropriate to support as a single Valkyrie adapter? Perhaps there could be multiple Valkyrie adapters for different cloud storage services, say a Google Drive adapter or a Dropbox adapter. And another challenge or question that really arose was one of discussing really persistence. I felt that as I was looking to explore how we could support the REST API that had been started to be implemented, it was clear that Browse Everything was really only designed for supporting uploads, or I should say more accurately, transfers from cloud storage services into one's repository. When it comes to persistence, this seems to have been something that that was an oversight and error in the designs that I had proposed to others who collaborated on this project. And I think that it might be worth exploring how maybe persistence could be supported using this emerging solution, or at least narrowly defining the scope of this project and providing a strategy for supporting persistence, such that no one feels as if they're trapped in a situation where they would like to not only read from, say, Google Drive, but also write to Google Drive under certain circumstances. Now, a lot of the work that was undertaken really took place much earlier this year, between January and March, to try and integrate these new Browse Everything 2 release with Figgy. There's basically been a heavy amount of early integration with the Google Picker API. This is really a JavaScript-driven approach to supporting Google Drive uploads. And under these circumstances, it became apparent that while the REST API was an excellent proof of concept, I don't know how useful it happens to have been for at least the Google Drive use cases. So I'm going to, I can, bring up an example. So here we have a test deployment of our Figgy Valkyrie implementation, or Valkyrie repository implementation. Apologies. I'm going to my account. So all of this interface is basically something that was a bit of a bottleneck for the actual process of working with Google Drive. It becomes apparent if one starts to work with supporting user interface development that Google is really quite opinionated in terms of trying to drive one towards using their own JavaScript user interface library. In this case, what they refer to as their Picker API. However, it does seem to have, it's implemented in plain JavaScript, so it's not specific to any framework. It can be readily integrated with React or any other framework that one might choose. And just let this moment. While the derivatives are being generated, I will state that one of the additional problems of working with the Google Picker API has been that it happens to have been a bit of a, it has some difficulty working within browsers, which happens to have ad blockers enabled or something along these lines. Oh, I'm sorry, this was working earlier. I'll try it maybe once more. All right, apologies. In the name of time, I'll just go forward and see if I can return to this. So from working with this Valkyrie implementation, repository implementation, I found that really a JavaScript-driven approach might be the preferred approach for working with supporting additional cloud storage services such as Dropbox. Amazon Web Services for S3 buckets also offers a software development kit, or SDK. OneDrive also offers this, and it feels more and more as if basically taking a very heavy JavaScript-driven approach with maybe the ability to rely upon the REST, a simple generic REST client for more customized drivers might make a bit more sense when it comes to supporting the other necessary drivers for a 2.0 release. So I did want to offer some time for questions and answers. I know that I condensed a bit of the material here. If there's any specific topics or anything that wasn't quite clear during this presentation, I'd be happy to discuss anything in relation to the Browse Everything 2.0 release or supporting the current 1.0 releases for Hyrax.
Thank you, James. It was a great presentation. There is no question under Q&A, but since the panelists cannot post question under Q&A, I do see in chat there are a few questions. One from Bhavana. Can the Blue Imp uploader be extended? Is the uploader a pluggable part in Hyrex?
It is. So the actual uploader itself is a separate project. I can share this within the Slack and chat as well, but if one looks within the labs organization, there's actually a project here, Browse Everything Redux React. And this is what supports the user interface. And the hope is that basically we'll be in the position with the 2.0 release to make this extensible. As one can see, it's in a very, very early state of development. But yes, this is based off of the Create React app solution. There was also some work that went into trying to restructure some of that into web components for those who might be interested or curious. But yes, it's definitely extensible and decoupled.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from her about Browse Everything. How does Browse Everything account for large file uploads from a drive through the browser?
So this is an excellent question, and this is primarily what created a number of obstacles for me when trying to support Google Drive. In the past, and this includes for the 1.0 release, Google Drive basically has a pagination mechanism which requires one to request pages of entire file listings or file metadata from a given drive. So how one does this efficiently is that Google actually supports batch requests and chunking for larger file downloads. I've found that because I'm using this Google Picker API, that's maintained by Google itself. It seems to be the case that if you use the Google Picker API as a JavaScript library alone, it seems to handle the uploads of large files pretty much on its own. You just need to provide a callback and provide it with some additional options. That being stated, I haven't tested this for anything beyond, I want to say maybe 8 gigabytes, and that might be too high. So if anything larger than this, I would need to test this in order to confirm that this wouldn't break even just using Google standalone Picker JavaScript library. And if it would be helpful, I can also offer my time in order to meet with you and try to test this.
Thanks. Next question is from Alberto Martinez. Have you thought of using SharePoint as well?
I have not. Thank you very much for that that suggestion. Currently, I need to basically return to implementing support for the other core drivers to ensure parity with the 1.0 releases. So following the support for Dropbox, Amazon S3, and OneDrive, SharePoint would definitely be something I'd be interested in exploring. Again, I think the limitation there would be based upon what they happen to offer for an API for a JavaScript library. But I'd like to if I could.
Okay. Next one is from Jonathan Rotchkin. Are there any plans for supporting Rails 6 on Browse Everything 1.x?
Yes, so I've been working with Rails 6 in order to try and get the uploads functioning with Figgy, and because this is something that requires Rails 6 basically provides you technically, at least it was the case at the time with the option for using Sprockets or Webpack for managing JavaScript assets, that presented some difficulties in terms of working with Engine Cart and testing for those who are familiar with that solution. But basically, it will work with Rails 6 and Webpack. I don't know if it will work with Sprockets. given that I've just had no opportunity to really test that and see if it actually breaks at this point in time. But with Webpack and Rails 6 releases, I definitely can confidently say it does work.
Okay. The next question is from Thomas. I like the idea of Browse Everything as a possible broker of Valkyrie persistence adapters. Can we have a Browse Everything sprint again this year?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I have been very interested in really returning to actively trying to push forward and kind of produce a Browse Everything release this year. And I am sincerely sorry for the delays involved in sort of returning to a lot of this work. But I truly hope to have the opportunity to return to collaborating with Thomas and others who invested so much of their time and really are responsible for carrying this work forward.
Yeah, that would be great. One last question from Bhavna. Does this Google Picker replace the Redux, aka Hyrex current uploader?
No, it would have to, and therein lies the problem. It's if you use the picker, you're basically going to be, if you don't want to use a browse, until we have Browse Everything finished, you would have to hack in a Google Picker library to your custom Hyrax implementation. So unfortunately, it's not something you could just swap in easily. It's something that you would have to hard code very and customize to your installation.
Okay, sounds good. I don't see any more questions here. We have few minutes before the interest group and working group updates. If anyone has any questions, you can post in Q&A section. Is there anything else, James, you can think of you want to talk about?
No, I just wanted to thank you everyone for your attention, and I look forward to returning to this work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for answering all the questions. These were like great questions. We have few minutes before the presentation, or we can just start early. I hope we have all the presentators for the interest group and working group. Okay, thanks, John, for sharing the screen. So we have about 6 interest group and working group updates, and it's gonna be all these interest group and working group chairs had 2 slides to just fill in their content, and they all will have 3 minutes each, and John would be forwarding these slides. So the first one we have is Chris for Marketing Working Group.
Hello, thank you very much then, Nabila. So I'll crack through these because I've slightly cheated by extending the number of slides a bit, but it should still only take 3 or 4 minutes. So my name is Chris Orr. I'm the current interim university librarian at the University of Hull in the UK, and I'm also chair of the Samvera Marketing Working Group. And as the slide there shows, we meet on a fortnightly basis at 11:30 Eastern Time on a Wednesday, with our next meeting being on the November the 4th, if anyone would like to join us. We're currently meeting using our Slack channel, which the tag for which is on the slide there, marketing_WG. And we have a wiki page where we keep up-to-date records of our activities, our agendas, and our records of what we do. So please take a look at that if you'd like to get a better idea of the work the group undertakes. The current members are listed there, and I'd like to say a great big thank you to all of those who have for their contribution and their help with pulling together the different ideas that we look to take forward. As ever, with a lot of the working groups, new members are welcome. Essentially, if you have someone who is like to help spread the word about Samvera, or who would like to has a particular gift for communicating the services that you provide through your libraries, then it'd be great to have them involved. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. So activity in recent months has been a little limited because of coronavirus priorities, because we had to give attention to what was happening at the members' home institutions. But the two main areas of focus have been expanding on how to engage with the Samvera vision, which we'll look at in a moment, and also development of a workshop on how the Samvera community can support digital strategy for AUL and equivalent staff, so focusing on senior staff within library organizations. We've also been, having reviewed the website in the first few months of this year, there have been one or two outstanding tweaks that came from that, which we've continued to do to keep it up to date and fresh. Next slide, please. So just to showcase, in case you haven't seen it, is on the front of our Samvera website, we have the Samvera vision, as it says there. And key to communicating this vision has been to highlight the key words within that vision, which essentially get to the crux of what we're trying to communicate to others when they come to look at Samvera. That we are a vibrant and welcoming community who share challenges, build expertise, create solutions, bringing digital collections or making them accessible now and into the future. So very much about a proactive engagement on how we actually look at the challenges that we are facing with regard to our digital collections, identify solutions, and seek to put them into practice. Each of those key words, as you'll see, has been linked to a somewhere else, and that's largely other more specific pages on the website, or in some cases on the wiki, which help people to take people directly to additional information which would help expand on that particular point. We've put in place those initial links. We welcome feedback on those. And if people have any other suggestions for where it might be useful to link those keywords, then do please let us know. Next slide, please. If you'd like to take a further look at what Samvera can offer by way of the services we offer and what Samvera is, then please do take a look at the Samvera FAQ. That is an extensive range of questions which have been collected from various different conversations in the past, various different engagements. Clearly, if you see a question that you have is not there, then again, please do let us know, because what we'd like to be able to do is to capture the questions that are arising so that we can provide an answer to them via that FAQ. We have a Samvera leaflet. Please take a look at that. And if you are coming to Samvera new, then please do use it and take on board what it raises. If you have any questions, then please do contact us through the mailing lists. If you're familiar and working with Samvera, please do use the leaflet to help with your internal promotion, or indeed, if you are talking about Samvera at other events, you can point people at the Samvera leaflet. And as evidenced by this presentation and others at Connect, we have a template that people can use for Samvera related presentations. And there is also a sample Samvera slide deck for introductions to Samvera, which can be used as you see fit. Next slide, please. In terms of our next steps, we want to try and explore a bit more about how Samvera and local implementations have been able to, or can, or will be able to support institutions in the current COVID-19 climate, i.e. how has the provision of online collections been able to assist, given the lack of access to physical resources because of COVID-19. It'd be good to try and understand that better, because it would highlight the value that Samvera and other repository solutions can offer. We'd like to build on the AUL workshop, which was delivered last Thursday as part of Connect this year. but we'd like to build on that to consider other audiences and whether or not more specific messaging or workshops for them would also be of value. And we'd like to add to the small number of user profiles and case studies that we have, knowing that there's a great deal of richness out there that we'd like to be able to present. Next slide. In fact, that's the last slide, so I'll move on to the next one now.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Next up is Adam.
All right. Just quick clarification. The UX, it's been an interest group, not quite a working group this past year. But yeah, traditionally, I guess more also pre-COVID times, our meeting time would be on the third Tuesday of each month at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And that is the current Slack, I guess, channel group name. So looking back at what the UX interest group did over the past year, so I guess the goal was to try to organize like monthly demos around the Samvera community of anything pertaining to UI, UX related concerns or new projects or just cool stuff people were working on. And we had some really good, helpful, informative presentations from Notch 8, Princeton, from the Avalon Media System Project. And then I would try to fill in the gaps when there was not quite so much stuff to volunteer to show. But more or less, we tried to do like a monthly like show and tell format just to kind of see what other people are working on. And I think that overall this approach for just sharing information seemed to work reasonably well. However, next slide, please. I also have come to a few realizations. So I've been the facilitator / co-facilitator for about 2 years with the UX interest group, and I've kind of seen the interest wane a bit here and there. And I would say my overall judgment is that there doesn't seem like a ton of interest in the UX interest group. I don't know what the norms are, but most meeting attendance, range from like 3 to 5 people, sometimes, upwards of like 10. But, not like huge numbers, I guess, for each monthly meeting. So I was thinking about that, and my thoughts were that I think user experience and UX is a pretty broad topic. And if it's not pinned to something like more concrete or more tangible, or to something like hierarchs or a certain application, possibly it's just like hard to focus those conversations. I think the most productive part of what the UX interest group accomplished, looking back over the past 2 years, about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2, we worked on a hierarchs accessibility audit, which was a really productive exercise with people from Penn State and Notre Dame. And that worked pretty well because, again, I think we had something to actually work on. And then lastly, my realization is I'm not a user experience expert. Most of my skill set, I guess, is more like UI, JavaScript, application development. In my opinion, I think user experience is a discipline in and of itself, of which I might not be the best representative of. So next slide, please. Is there one more slide? Yep. So what I'm proposing, and I brought this up to the partners meeting last week, is 1 of 2 options: either transitioning from UX to UI working or interest group, or option number 2, we could leave the UX interest group if someone else is curious or interested in picking up and being a facilitator on that, about more like user experience related issues and concerns. Ping me. And we could leave that group and have like a UI working group be more of an offshoot. So how would it be different? in my mind, I think a UI interest group would be focused more on implementation. So, you know, it might be a little bit more technical on like how to achieve UI related outcomes through JavaScript, CSS, HTML, standard, I think like current, you know, front end tool sets. It would definitely have a focus on accessibility. That would be a primary concern of the interest group. And actually, we just had a little chat about this in the UX interest group Slack channel. And it would be focusing on the implementation of accessibility instead of more general accessibility concerns. But how do we actually like monitor our apps accessibility like levels, and what can we do to improve those? Another focus to be on shareable user interfaces, components, potentially like component libraries. I know there was a comment earlier on about that in a presentation we gave. And also an interest would be like, is there a common ground for UI related concerns or projects or anything like amongst Samvera applications or amongst like shareable packages or JavaScript modules or style guides, pattern libraries amongst Samvera developers. And lastly, a focus on just making UI look and perform as professionally as possible. And again, it would focus on some of the other, you know, it could also discuss some of the latest trends, such as like static site generators. We saw a presentation earlier on mentioning like Gatsby or Next.js or some of these tool sets that are kind of emerging and getting a lot of popularity as of late. Could also think about UI component architecture and how to actually build single page apps. That'd be something we could discuss. Could be concerned with reusable design systems and focusing on NPM, open source, module development as well, and just how to share interesting or helpful open source packages and projects. And I think a UI interest group could be geared towards developers, team leads, managers, application architect. It doesn't have to be just developers. I think it could be of interest to anyone that's involved in either planning out UI related stuff or developers themselves. So if people are interested in this, I'm going to keep, or I guess we'll keep the UX interest group Slack channel open for a little while and try to figure out what the path forward kind of looks like. And if people are interested, feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Adam. We have Nora and Anna.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Goslin, and I'm one of the co-facilitators of the Samvera Metadata Interest Group, along with Nora Egloff. And I'm happy to be here today to just give a brief update about the Samvera Metadata Interest Group. So SMIG meets on the 4th Tuesday of the month from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern via Zoom. And our calls average around 10 to 15 participants. And our next meeting is on Tuesday, November 24th. And we can be found on Slack in the Samvera metadata channel. So the goals of SMIG are to identify models that may help community newcomers, furthering interoperability among Samvera projects, providing support for the community and a place to ask metadata questions, providing ways to share metadata work, collecting documentation in order to more broadly facilitate shared modeling, and developing and charging working groups for the Samvera community metadata activities. Next slide. Our wiki is shown here and includes information about the group's current activities, as well as meeting information such as meeting notes and call-in instructions. And since Virtual Connect, we've had some great work done by 2 of our current working groups, the Control Vocabularies Decision Tree Working Group and the Hyrax version 3 Metadata Application Profile Documentation Working Group. The chairs of those groups, Julie Hardesty and Nora Egloff, respectively, will be giving updates on these groups in just a few minutes right after this update. So thank you, and that's all I have.
Thanks, Anna. The next one is Julie. And just wanted to remind everyone that you can post your questions on the Slack channel, because we will not have a question answer time for all the interest and working group updates. Julie, you are up next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Julie Hardesty from Indiana University, and the Samvera Controlled Vocabularies Decision Tree Working Group has been working since February of this year. And I want to thank the members. First off, Don Childress, Gretchen Geegan, Rebecca Patillo, Eric Radio, and Lynette Rail. This has been a really great collaboration. Next slide, please. So I kind of glossed over the Samvera Slack channel and the meeting times, because as you can see, our time frame is kind of sort of, we're supposedly done right now, and we're almost there. So we're pretty close to being finished. Our goal for this was to provide a decision tree for finding and evaluating and using controlled vocabularies behind descriptive metadata fields. So this is kind of something we're interested in for the Samvera community, as well as more generally, just a general concept of how do you go about finding a controlled vocabulary and deciding that it's worth it to use it or not. But we're also interested in something that's useful to the Samvera community specifically in terms of how to incorporate a controlled vocabulary within Hyrax. So when we approach this with the deliverables of trying to identify use cases, so we've got Hyrax examples that we're specifically looking at, trying to identify ways to find controlled vocabularies, sources to go to for controlled vocabularies, and then identifying how to do an evaluation of a controlled vocabulary to decide if it's good to use, and then specifically in Hyrax, providing examples within Hyrax for making use of adding or changing a controlled vocabulary for descriptive metadata in Hyrax. Next slide, please. So we've got a couple of outputs. We've got the decision tree document that looks at, it's approaching it in levels. So there's controlled vocabulary, looking at reviewing what comes with a product that you might be using, what you need to consider to replace a controlled vocabulary, or if you need to create or edit or modify a controlled vocabulary for use. And then with each of these, we're trying to provide Hyrax examples. And this is connecting over to the other output that we've created, which is a controlled vocabulary and criteria spreadsheet of options that we've gathered so far. And that's just getting started. We sent this out to the Samvera Metadata Google group for review in September. So we're just now doing review work of this. So next slide, please. And the spreadsheet of controlled vocabularies and criteria is really a work in progress. We're trying to establish how we want to put this together. We're hoping to set it up so that it can be collaboratively added to. So how that should work. So all of this is out for feedback and review right now. So we're actually, tomorrow, there's going to be a lightning talk that's going to get a little bit more into the details of those outputs. And we're going to be asking for feedback from the community. So you can take a look at things now on the CV Decision Tree Working Group wiki page, which is underneath the Samvera Metadata Interest Group. And you can check out the lightning talk tomorrow. And that's what I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Next up, we have Nora.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so the Hyrax 3 Metadata Application Profile Documentation Working Group is another subgroup of SMIG. And we spun up in March just to do a thorough review of the existing metadata documentation within the community and basically just on a project needed basis. And I think this and the controlled vocabulary decision tree are a good example of the, for newcomers to the community, of how the interest group and working group framework can work to just do specific tasks for the community when there's an identified need. So we've been meeting on occasional Wednesdays from 9 to 10 a.m. Was every 2 weeks, but it's slowed down as the work has been completed. Our website is a wiki child page of the metadata interest group page, so it can be found there or at this link. And these are our members. I'd like to thank all of them for their hard work and for diligently meeting many times to get this work done. Next slide, please. So our tasks and goals to be delivered by the release of HYRAX 3 or Samvera Connect 2020, whichever came first, which in this case, Connect came first, was to do an environmental scan of the existing documentation, just places where folks can find information about metadata application profile in order to migrate into a Samvera solution bundle, in this case, HYRAX, to look at what changes have been done since the 2.0 release, as well as any relevant working group outputs that we could incorporate. Then to generate updated documentation and to share and encourage its use. I think that really makes it easier to migrate in if you kind of know what you're getting into and how the metadata application profiles behave for generic works and collections out of the box. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 main deliverables of the working group. We've created a metadata application profile spreadsheet that is linked off several wiki pages and also off the knowledge base. The main knowledge base page that contains information about metadata is this defining metadata in the model page, which reflected, I think, 2.3 stable release. So it was a few releases back. So we've updated the language on that, as well as the tables, to reflect how HYRAX 3 core and basic metadata will function out of the box. So that contains information like cardinality, the predicates, how different namespaces define metadata properties. And these are configurable by the user, but this is just how it functions out of the box. And lastly, we've made a HYRAX 3 version of the M3 spec YAML file. If you're a newcomer and perhaps you have no idea what that is, M3 stands for the Machine Readable Metadata Modeling Working Group, and that was a working group subgroup of SMIG from the past couple years. And they created a application agnostic specification for machine readable metadata. And we created an adaptation of that, which is specifically for HYRAX 3. And I have to give a shout out to Anna Marie Close, a member of both M3 working group and this one, for really being a driving force behind that. So that spec is now available in the Houndstooth GitHub repo, which is linked in the slide. And that just presents an alternative view that's both machine readable and maybe a bit more legible to developers for how metadata behaves in the application. So these 3 deliverables are all basically complete, although we're going to wait until the stable release of 3 to make the commit for the knowledge base site. Next slide, please. So for next steps, we have taken like a month break from meeting, but our next meeting is on November 18th. And we're currently just monitoring the final stages of development for the HYRAX 3 release and the kind of quality assurance testing that's going on for that right now. And we'd like to use this opportunity during Samvera Connect to share these outputs, make folks aware of the work that goes into maintaining updated documentation. And hopefully, if anyone has any feedback and would like to take the time to review these, comment on whether or not they're helpful to you, or if there's information that you feel should be there but is lacking, please feel free to do so. And you could let us know this feedback through our Slack channel, which is up here on the page. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nora. Next up it's me. So for repo management interest group, Moira Downey from Duke and I co-chair this group, and the regular meetings are first Monday of the month at 1 p.m. The Slack channel is Repo Managers, and there's a link to the website. The purpose of this group is just for all different kinds of managers. I don't even want to say all managers. It's like it's open to anyone who is working with a HireX repo, and you are welcome to come and join us. The activities that we have done since last Connect is we helped conduct Q&A testing for the new HireX release. And we have had several presentations from Palki and Duke on their recent HireX work. And now in the future, we are looking forward to work with Julie as the HireX PO and Heather as the community manager. And we are thinking about the charge and the alignment of this group with the other groups like the HireX interest group or the other group that exists. Next slide, please. So generally, this group is charged with providing input on feature development and generally generating use cases for and feedback on specific feature implementation. This is an avenue for informal sharing and discussing recent work done on Samvera projects and apps, general non-developer community engagement. And it is open to all types of manager roles or anyone working with any HireX repository. It's more like non-technical group. So if you have any questions about how your HireX repo is doing, or if you want to share anything about your HireX repos, please join us. We meet every first Monday of the month, and the next meeting is on November 2nd. So that was all for all the interest group and working groups. And here we are at the end of the second day. So thank you, everyone. On behalf of the program committee, I really want to say thanks to all the presenters and all of you as participants for listening in to all the presentation and for the great questions asked. And also I want to say thank you to all the helpers and tech group, all of them working behind the screen. So for making this a really success. Thank you all. So this is end of today's presentation, but there is a community event today at 2:30, and you would have a link for that as a separate link. So I hope you can all join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time, 8 a.m. Pacific time, and 15 GMT. Thank you, everyone. See you all tomorrow. Bye.